In the quiet hours of the night, when the world outside softens into a hush and only the faint sound of wind brushing against window panes or the patter of distant rain keeps time, there lies a history that most chronicles do not speak of. A history that did not find a place in official records, yet lived vibrantly in shadows, in verses, in secret gestures. This is the untold history of homosexuality in the Islamic Caliphates, where beneath the grandeur of palaces and the solemnity of mosques, there flowed hidden rivers of desire and love that refused to be erased by decree or shame. Imagine yourself now sinking into your bed, a dim lamp flickering gently beside you, the air cool and still, your body relaxing as though preparing not only for sleep, but for a slow journey across time. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss these secret doorways into forgotten worlds. And tell us, where are you listening from tonight? What city? What hour? What quiet space holds you as this story begins to weave its spell around you? For tonight, we travel back to the Abbasid Caliphate, to the dazzling city of Baghdad, a city of scholars and poets, a city where minarets caught the morning sun and narrow alleys hummed with merchants selling spices, silks, and secrets. Picture the House of Wisdom, its walls lined with books and scrolls, scholars bending over manuscripts by candlelight, translating, debating, preserving knowledge from Greek philosophers and Persian astronomers. Yet in the very same city, in quieter corners, another kind of knowledge circulated, not of stars or medicine, but of glances, of coded words and poems, of laughter that carried meanings too fragile to speak aloud. Imagine walking through a moonlit courtyard, marble floors cool beneath bare feet, the scent of jasmine curling in the night air, and somewhere nearby the soft strumming of a lute. A young man pauses, not because he hears something, but because he feels that lingering gaze from another across the courtyard, that silent acknowledgement that their lives are woven by a thread neither scripture nor law could fully sever. In the Caliphate, religion and law spoke firmly about morality, yet poetry often told another story. Poets like Abu Nuwas, celebrated and scandalous, wrote verses that dared to describe affection between men with tenderness and wit. His poems, recited in taverns, remembered in hushed tones, sometimes condemned, sometimes admired, but never ignored. The contradiction was striking. A society that condemned yet could not silence, that punished yet continued to sing. Imagine the bathhouses of Basra, steam rising like veils in the air, tiled walls echoing with laughter and whispers, men slipping into the hot waters, their bodies brushing, their voices low, their words layered with meanings only some could decode. Picture Andalusian gardens under the Umayyads of Córdoba, fountains trickling, orange blossoms perfuming the night, where young companions of scholars recited verses heavy with double meanings, cloaked as metaphors for divine love but pulsing with human desire. These moments did not exist as isolated transgressions, but as threads in a tapestry woven across centuries of Islamic rule, threads that remind us that love and longing in all their forms resist the neat borders of legality or doctrine. And yet, alongside these moments of beauty and longing, there was also fear. There was risk, for a glance too long, a poem too bold, a rumor whispered too carelessly could mean disgrace or punishment. It is within this tension that these lives unfolded, balanced delicately between secrecy and expression, between silence and song. Picture now a palace chamber in Baghdad, its air heavy with incense, silken curtains swaying gently with the night breeze, and a young caliph seated on a cushion, a goblet of wine in his hand, listening to music while his favorite companions recline. Nearby, their beauty as much a spectacle as the jewels on the walls. History remembers caliphs for their conquests and decrees. But what the chroniclers often hid, poetry revealed: the tenderness, the desire, the human vulnerability behind the throne. There are stories of caliphs whose preferences were the subject, of gossip, whose court poets teased and praised with lines that left little doubt of their meaning. These were not always hidden scandals. Sometimes they were woven into the culture itself, tolerated in one breath, condemned in the next. Across the empire, in Damascus, In Cairo, in Kairouan, in Samarra, the same stories surface of students and teachers whose bonds extended beyond learning, of soldiers in their tents finding warmth in one another during long campaigns, of slaves whose beauty was described with a candor that left little to the imagination, of merchants whose companionship on long journeys became something deeper than friendship. This history is not simple. It is layered with contradictions, with moments of light and shadow, with humor and sorrow. One can imagine a group of friends gathered in a courtyard, drinking under the stars, a poet reciting a verse that makes them laugh with its audacity, the kind of laughter that carries a touch of rebellion, as if to say, we exist, we feel, even if the law pretends we do not. And in another corner of the Caliphate, one can imagine the loneliness of someone who feels their desires are forbidden, who hides their longing behind silence, whose nights are heavy with unspoken dreams. Both truths live side by side, woven into the same civilization. And as you lie here now, listening, your eyes perhaps growing heavy, your breath slowing, the distant world of the Caliphates begins to soften into focus, not as a list of rulers and battles, but as a living, breathing world of people who loved, desired, feared, and hoped, much like we do. This story asks nothing of you but to listen, to let yourself drift into that quiet recognition that history is not only what was written, but also what was hidden, and that even in silence, truth endures. In the layered silence of night, the story widens, and the city of Baghdad no longer appears only as a jewel of scholarship and power, but as a living organism where every alley and courtyard carried secrets, where the grandeur of mosques and palaces was matched by the intimacy of private longing hidden in plain sight. And in these unseen spaces, love spoke in a language that could not be confined by decrees or erased by clerks. Imagine again the crowded markets, stalls overflowing with silks from China, spices from India, incense from Yemen, voices weaving together in 100 dialects. And yet beneath the noise, there were always undertones, the glances that lingered. Too long, the shopkeeper whose compliments stretched beyond mere politeness, the traveler whose eyes betrayed an intimacy beyond trade. Poets captured these currents with words that carried double edges, verses that praised the curve of a cheek or the light in a boy's eyes under the pretense of allegory, so that anyone who wished to see only metaphor could, and those who lived within the truth could recognize themselves mirrored. The most famous of these voices was Abu Nuwas, whose poetry continues to unsettle and delight even now, for his verses celebrated wine, freedom, beauty, and love between men with such openness that later generations tried to edit or suppress them, though never successfully. He sang of the tavern, the bath, the orchard, and the beloved with equal devotion, and in doing so he gave form to a world that official scribes pretended did not exist. His words remind us that even in societies where morality was tightly guarded, human nature spilled through the cracks with laughter, with longing, with shameless joy. And Abu Nuwas was not alone. His contemporaries, his imitators, even his critics, all contributed to a dialogue where desire was both celebrated and condemned, woven into the very fabric of cultural expression. Picture a circle of young men, gathered in a garden at dusk, the air perfumed with roses and mint, a poet reciting lines that cause his audience to shift uncomfortably, torn between scandal and enchantment, their laughter carrying the thrill of defiance. Yet beyond poetry, this reality was lived in countless ordinary lives. In the military camps along the frontiers of the Caliphate, far from the mosques of the cities, bonds between soldiers formed out of necessity and deepened into something unspoken but undeniable. Nights in tents were long, winters cold, fear constant, and it was in these spaces that men found comfort in one another, sometimes temporary, sometimes lasting, yet always real, even if history wrote only of their battles. In the palaces of caliphs, young pages and servants often became objects of affection, their beauty described by chroniclers in the same breath as their loyalty or treachery, though the tone always veiled and careful. In the bathhouses, where steam wrapped everybody in equal softness, Strangers and companions alike moved within a realm where touch could carry meanings unrecorded. These were not merely places of hygiene, but of social gathering, of gossip, of transactions, both spoken and unspoken, where the vulnerability of nakedness blurred boundaries and allowed secrets to find expression in fleeting gestures. And in the courts of Andalusia, under the Umayyads, the same themes thrived in gardens filled with fountains and mosaics, where music drifted on warm nights and poetry of longing was shared in both. Arabic and the blossoming vernaculars of Spain dot there. The intersection of cultures, Arab, Berber, Jewish, Christian, created an atmosphere where the boundaries of art and desire grew porous, and stories of male companionship and affection were whispered as part of daily life. One could imagine a young scholar in Córdoba writing a commentary on Aristotle, by day and at night composing a secret verse to the one who held his heart, a verse that might never be spoken aloud yet burned within him as brightly as the oil lamp by which he studied. Beyond poetry and philosophy, there were darker threats too. The same society that could laugh at a scandalous poem could also punish harshly when lines were crossed, and men and women who dared too openly to live there, desire sometimes face exile, imprisonment, or worse. The tension between tolerance and condemnation was constant, a reflection of the larger paradox of human societies, to legislate morality on one hand and to indulge in its forbidden fruits on the other. Yet it is within this paradox that we find the most human of truth, for even under threat, people continue to love, to seek companionship, to risk discovery for the sake of intimacy. A traveler might record in his diary the customs of Cairo's bathhouses, noting the way men linger too long in one another's company, hinting but never stating, leaving the reader to draw the conclusion. A merchant might carry a poem across the sea that spoke of longing in such universal terms that it could be sung in Sicily as easily as in Damascus. These scattered traces, fragile but persistent, remind us that history is not only the record of power, but also the archive of desire. And desire cannot be erased by decree. Imagine now lying beneath the stars in a desert caravan, camels resting nearby, the fire burning low, men gathered close for warmth, their laughter soft, and their shoulders touching in the quiet. In that closeness, in that shared breath, lies a truth as old as humanity, a truth that persists no matter how often it is denied. And as you breathe slowly now, your own body relaxing further, the distant centuries feel less like abstractions and more like mirrors, reflecting not only what was forbidden, but what was lived, what was whispered, what was sung, and what remains, even now. As a quiet undercurrent in the story of civilization as the story drifts further into the layered heart of the Caliphates, we begin to see that what was spoken in poetry and whispered in gardens was not only the indulgence of the privileged, but part of the lived fabric of entire communities. So that desire and intimacy traveled not just in palaces or scholarly circles, but through the narrow alleys of ordinary life, breathing in the rhythm of the streets, the markets, the hammams, and even the caravanserais where weary travelers stop for a night's rest. Imagine entering one such caravanserai on the road between Damascus and Aleppo, the evening falling quiet after the shuffle of hooves and the unpacking of goods, the smell of roasted meat and smoke drifting into the cool desert air, and among the travelers gathered around the courtyard fire. There is laughter, there is song, but also there are glances exchanged, a look held too long between two men who both know that by morning they will ride in different directions. Yet in that single night, they find an intimacy that neither law nor distance can diminish. These fleeting connections, preserved not in chronicles but in memory and verse, remind us that history was not lived in proclamations but in moments of breath and touch. The scholars of jurisprudence debated the morality of such encounters, writing fatwas that condemned or circled cautiously around the subject. Yet at the same time, medical texts and philosophical works from the same era spoke candidly about desire, sometimes with surprising frankness, describing the affections of men for men or the bonds of women with women as, if these were not aberrations, but simply part of the spectrum of human nature. In the writings of certain physicians, one can find descriptions of attraction treated as a natural inclination, sometimes even as a temperament of the body. And though later centuries would attempt to narrow interpretation, the existence of these texts reveals that the conversation was not always as one-sided as it might seem through the lens of later moral rigidity. Picture Andalusia again, Córdoba or Granada, where under the Umayyads and later the Taifa kings, the arts flourished with such vibrancy that beauty itself became a kind of worship. And in that worship, the beauty of young men was celebrated as often as the beauty of women, immortalized in poems that described their eyes, their hair, their gestures, their laughter, with an attention so detailed it leaves no doubt of the passions behind the words. A banquet in an Andalusian palace might feature music, wine, recitation, and in the background, the unspoken yet undeniable knowledge that affection between men was not rare, but woven into the culture, tolerated in ways that defy simple explanation. At the same time, we cannot romanticize this world without acknowledging its shadows. For in the same Andalusian courts, there were also clerics who condemned such desires fiercely, and ordinary people who risked disgrace or punishment if their love became too visible. This constant push and pull between openness and repression, between poetry that celebrated and law that condemned, created a kind of double existence, a society that could laugh at scandalous verses one moment and enforce punishment the next. And it was within this fragile space that lives unfolded. Imagine now a scholar in Cairo in the Fatimid period, seated in a study surrounded by shelves of scrolls, writing by lamplight as he comments on Aristotle, his pen steady. Yet in his heart burning a longing, he dares not write of except an allegory. Perhaps he copies a line of Greek philosophy about friendship, bending its meaning so that those who read innocently will find only philosophy, while those who know the hidden codes will see it for what it is, a confession, a declaration hidden in the folds of reason. In another corner of the city, in a hammam filled with steam and murmured voices, two women sit close, their laughter mingling with the water's echo, their hands brushing in ways that reveal a tenderness rarely recorded but always felt, for female desire was even more hidden, silenced by layers of invisibility, and yet persisted, finding its expression in the shared intimacies of baths, in the poetry of certain female poets whose voices survive only in fragments, in the unspoken, but powerful bonds of companionship. These untold stories remind us that sexuality in the Caliphates was not a simple binary of acceptance or rejection, but a vast spectrum of lived realities that moved through every class, every city, every generation. Soldiers wrote of their companions. Merchants carried stories from one region to another. Scholars encoded longing in metaphors of light and knowledge, and poets dared to say what others would not. Some caliphs themselves became figures of rumor and gossip, their preferences noted with more than a trace of scandal. Yet such whispers never erased their power or authority, revealing again the paradox of a world where morality and reality were always in negotiation. Picture the vast city of Samarra, once the seat of the Abbasid caliphs, with its spiraling minaret rising above the plains, and within its sprawling palaces, young guards and pages moving silently through candlelit corridors, their presence part of the majesty of the court, but also part of its unspoken intimacies. Chroniclers describe these courts with an ambivalence that suggests more than they dared to record, leaving us to read between the lines of silence. And beyond the palaces, beyond the scholars, beyond the poets, there were countless unnamed people who lived their truths quietly, perhaps only in a fleeting glance, in the comfort of a friend's embrace, in a whispered verse shared by lamplight. And though they left no record, their existence hums beneath the surface of history, like a current we can still feel if we listen closely. As you rest here, your breath deepening, your mind drifting gently with these images, the centuries collapse into a single recognition that love and desire, no matter how hidden, always find their way. That even in the most guarded of societies, the human heart speaks in ways no law can silence, and that the echoes of those whispers remain with us, soft but enduring, like the murmur of distant water in the stillness of night. In the still unfolding expanse of this hidden history, the caliphates reveal themselves not only as empires of power and conquest, but as layered human worlds where art, desire, and contradiction coexisted in ways that remain both familiar and elusive. And when one closes their eyes to listen, the cities of that age return like living murals, painted not in stone alone but in glances, in voices, in silences that spoke louder than decrees. Picture Damascus under the Umayyads, its streets filled with the scent of spices and the cries of merchants, its mosques echoing with the prayers of thousands, and somewhere in its quieter neighborhoods, homes where gatherings took place evenings, filled with music and verse, where men reclined on cushions sharing wine and poetry, where beauty was not simply admired but adored, and where desire moved like an undercurrent through every conversation. Chroniclers record the grandeur of rulers, the victories of armies, yet in the margins of these records are hints of lives lived differently, stories passed in whispers of caliphs who favored certain companions, of poets who were both praised and condemned for daring to speak a love that exceeded boundaries. These glimpses are fragments, yet when pieced together, they form a mosaic of lives that official history chose to overlook. Andalusia, too, offers its own fragments, where the fusion of Arab, Berber, and European cultures created a unique atmosphere, one where the arts flourish and where beauty, both male and female, was celebrated with an intensity that seemed to defy the strictures of law. In the gardens of Córdoba, under the arches striped with red and white stone, the laughter of courtiers mingled with the sound of water flowing through marble channels. And in the poetry recited, there one can still hear the echo of longing, sometimes for a woman, often for a man, always wrapped in metaphors that allowed plausible deniability yet carried unmistakable meaning for those who understood. Some of these poems survive today, carrying across centuries the voices of lovers who were never allowed to name themselves openly, but who still carved their existence into words that could not be erased. Elsewhere, in Cairo during the Fatimid era, the intellectual ferment that filled its mosques and academies also found reflection in social life. Scholars wrote treatises on ethics and metaphysics, while at the same time acknowledging in private correspondence that human affection could not always be neatly constrained. The Hammams of Cairo became social centers as much as places of cleansing, where men of every class mingled, their bodies equalized in steam, their conversations drifting between politics, gossip, and the unspoken language of desire and for women too. The hammam became one of the few places where closeness could be expressed with an intimacy denied elsewhere. A fragile space of shared laughter, touch, and companionship. Stories survive of female poets who, though less celebrated than their male counterparts, dared to write of their love for other women. Their verses often disguised in the language of friendship, but carrying undertones of passion. And while these voices are rare, they remind us that silence was never complete, that even when erased, fragments of truth remained. Moving further east, into Persia under the Seljuks, the poetic traditions of earlier centuries flowered into mystical verse, where Sufi poets spoke of divine love, using language so sensual and so charged with human imagery that one cannot help but see within it the double meaning, the blurring of spiritual and physical longing. Whether intended or not, the imagery of the beloved in Sufi poetry often drew from male beauty, and readers across generations recognized themselves in those verses, finding in them a reflection of desire both human and transcendent. To imagine these scenes is to understand that the caliphates were not uniform in their attitudes, that the experience of love and desire shifted across regions and centuries, sometimes tolerated, sometimes punished, often hidden but never absent. The contradictions were profound. Rulers who ordered harsh punishments for same-sex relations while themselves rumored to indulge. Scholars who condemned publicly but wrote privately with ambiguity. Communities that laughed at verses one day and enforced morality the next. Within these contradictions lay the daily lives of countless individuals who loved as they could, who found fleeting moments of intimacy in gardens in caravans, in hammams, in secret letters, in songs that carried meanings only for the initiated. Picture again Baghdad, not in the glory of its palaces, but in the narrow alleys where children play by day and by night. Young men and women lean from windows to exchange words too dangerous to speak aloud in daylight, where the moonlit courtyards became stages for encounters so subtle they would vanish without trace if not for the memory of those who felt them. Imagine a soldier on the frontiers, wrapped in his cloak against the cold, pressed shoulder to shoulder with his companion under the stars, their closeness both necessity and longing, a human truth carried silently across generations. Imagine a poet seated by candlelight, ink staining his fingers, hesitating as he chooses words, knowing that every line he writes will carry the weight of his secret, yet also the liberation of its expression. And imagine now, as you listen with your breath slowing, how these lives, forgotten by official history, continue to echo like soft music through time, reminding us that desire does not disappear when silenced, that love persists even in shadows, and that every civilization, no matter how grand or guarded, carries within it the quiet pulse of those who dare to feel dot in the endless weave of this hidden tapestry. The story moves further into the subtleties of daily life under the vast umbrella of the Caliphates, where intimacy and desire did not only reside in palaces and courts, but lived equally in the spaces of ordinary people, where bakers, scribes, apprentices, travelers, and servants each carried within them the same unspoken longings and delicate negotiations of secrecy, and in their lives too the quiet persistence of love unfolded, like faint ink that stains the page even when time tries to erase it. Imagine wandering through a bustling market in Caravan, the North African city once celebrated as a center of religion and trade. Its streets filled with the bright colors of woven carpets, copper vessels gleaming under the sun, dates piled high in baskets, and amidst this noise and barter, young men brushing past one another with smiles that carry meanings hidden from the crowd. A glance held for the briefest moment before vanishing into anonymity again. The poetry of the Maghreb, less well known than that of Baghdad or Córdoba, also preserved these moments, where verses sometimes slipped into hints of affection between men, dressed in metaphors of friendship or companionship, but saturated with deeper currents of longing. And beyond poetry, the stories carried orally through families, through gossip, through rumor, leave faint shadows of relationships that were never formally recorded, but nevertheless existed. In the desert caravans that stitched together the empire, merchants spoke not only of prices and politics, but sometimes of the beauty of a fellow traveler, laughter shared under the moon, the warmth of sleeping close on a cold night. These memories often remain unspoken in public, yet lived on in the minds of those who carried them. In Persia, court records reveal layers of contradictions, for chronicles would often praise the beauty of male pages and attendants, noting the color of their hair, the clarity of their skin, the grace of their movements, while at the same time condemning the desires they inspired, a paradox that reveals the impossibility of erasing human affection even as it was censured. In the Seljuk and Ghaznavid courts, young men were often described with the same language used for maidens, and poets celebrated them openly enough that their words survive as testimony to a culture where beauty was beauty, regardless of gender, and where desire, even forbidden, was woven into the very texture of society. In the Hammams of Samarkand, as in Cairo and Basra, the same rituals unfolded. Men stripped of rank and wealth by steam and water, equalized in nakedness, moving within a world where laughter and touch could carry meanings hidden from outside eyes, and within these walls companionship could transform briefly into intimacy, unrecorded yet profoundly real. For women too, especially in private households, bonds formed within the isolation of the harem or the companionship of domestic spaces, bonds that might never have been spoken openly, but nevertheless provided comfort, tenderness, and sometimes passion. Chroniclers rarely wrote of women loving women, but fragments survive. Stories of jealousy within harems, of rivalries, not only for the affection of a ruler, but also for one another, of verses exchanged that spoke with the softness of longing disguised as sisterhood. Imagine a secluded courtyard where women gather in the cool of the evening, their laughter echoing as they share stories, a hand lingering a moment longer than it needs to, a gesture so small that history could overlook it. Yet in that gesture, a whole secret life is revealed. The tension of these hidden realities lay always between fear and expression, between suppression and celebration. Legal codes across the caliphates varied, sometimes harsh in punishment, sometimes leaving space for ambiguity, yet in every case, the law struggled against the persistence of human nature, for love is not obedient to decrees. And so people found ways to live within the cracks, to express themselves through poetry, through coded language, through fleeting encounters, through loyalty disguised as friendship. The voices of mystics also offered refuge, for Sufi poetry often blurred the lines between human and divine love. And in this blur, people found space to imagine and to feel without fear, for a verse praising the beloved's beauty might be claimed as allegory of God, yet those who longed for human touch could hear it as their own story reflected back. This double meaning became a form of survival, allowing poetry to carry truths that prose could never admit. Abu Nuwas remained the boldest example, but many others followed, weaving their truths into verse like threads hidden in a carpet, visible only to those who knew how to see. The paradox of the caliphates was that even in societies that outwardly condemn, art flourished with imagery that revealed the very desires silenced in law. And beyond the poets and the mystics, beyond the courts and the hammams, there were simply people living their lives, people who found intimacy where they could, who risked discovery for the sake of affection, who carried in their hearts the knowledge that they were part of a story larger than themselves, a story not recorded in chronicles but preserved in the undercurrent of culture, a story we can still sense in the silences of history. Imagine now a quiet rooftop in Damascus, stars blazing overhead, two young men sitting side by side, their shoulders brushing, speaking softly of dreams, of fears, of longing, knowing that when dawn comes they must return to the roles expected of them. But for that one night, under that sky, they are simply themselves. Imagine a pair of women in Córdoba sharing verses they have written for one another, laughing at their own daring, tucking the scraps of parchment away before anyone else can. See, yet carrying the words in their memory as a treasure more enduring than any jewel. These are the lives that remain unseen in official chronicles, yet vibrate beneath them like a heartbeat. And as you rest listening now, you can feel the persistence of that heartbeat, a rhythm that carries across centuries to remind us that history is not only what is written, but what is lived, what is whispered, what is hidden in plain sight, and what survives in the quiet places where law cannot reach. The story deepens as we look further into the daily patterns of life across the caliphates, where the grand sweep of empire often obscures the quiet truths of ordinary existence. Truths that reveal how human desires slip through the narrow spaces between law and culture, living in shadows but never extinguished, shaping lives in ways that history only faintly recorded. In the great libraries of Baghdad, where scholars copied and translated the works of Aristotle, Plato, and Galen, they encountered discussions of love between men presented without the moral panic that later centuries would attach. And some of these ideas were debated openly in intellectual circles, even as preachers in the mosques condemned them, showing that contradiction was not an exception, but the fabric of daily thought. A physician might write about the temperaments of the body, explaining that certain inclinations of desire were as natural as eye color or voice, while a jurist at the same time wrote sternly of punishments and prohibitions, and in this friction lay the reality of a civilization that could never reduce its people to a single moral code. Imagine a lecture in a madrasa where philosophy students debated the Greek idea of male friendship as a form of virtue, while outside the lecture hall, two companions walked together through shaded courtyards, their hands brushing, their conversation lingering on subjects that veered into intimacy unspoken but understood. In the courts of rulers, music filled the air alongside poetry, and the beauty of young attendants was praised openly in ways that leave little doubt of the desires they inspired. These attendants, sometimes slaves, sometimes chosen companions, were described with the same language that poets use for maidens, celebrated for their grace, their eyes, their voices, creating a strange paradox where the same society that condemned in doctrine indulged in description. Picture a banquet in Nishaper, candles flickering against walls painted with intricate designs, musicians playing while wine cups were passed, and a poet standing to recite verses so daring that the room fills with laughter, half nervous, half delighted, a laughter that carries with it the unspoken knowledge that all present have felt what the poet describes, even if they must never admit it outside those walls. In the bazaars of Cairo, where goods from across Africa and Asia crowded the stalls, gossip traveled as quickly as spices, and among the stories of trade and politics came rumors of affection between rulers and their favorites. Tales told half in scandal, half in awe, a reminder that power did not erase human longing, but often amplified its theater. In the Hammams of Damascus, the thick steam wrapped everybody in the same mist, erasing class, erasing titles, and within this blur, a glance could stretch longer than custom allowed. A touch could linger under the cover of ritual, and in these moments, love found its fragile space. For women too, intimacy lived in hidden places, in the closed courtyards of houses, in the long hours of embroidery or storytelling, in the companionship that grew into something more, seldom recorded but occasionally surfacing in the rare verses of female poets whose lines speak of longing in ways that can still be felt centuries later. One fragment tells of sleepless nights spent thinking of another woman's voice, words that seem innocent until one feels the weight of what cannot be said openly. In Andalusia, poets celebrated not only the beauty of the beloved, but also the anguish of secrecy, verses that speak of the torment of hiding love, of disguising passion under layers of metaphor. And in their words, we sense the tension of a society that forced people to live double lives, one for the public eye, one for the heart. Imagine a young poet standing in the courtyard of the Alhambra, reciting lines under the moonlight, his voice trembling as he praises his beloved in terms so carefully veiled that his listeners nod at the allegory, while the one person meant to understand hears the truth hidden within. Imagine a soldier riding out across the desert, carrying with him a small scrap of verse from his companion, hidden in his pack like a talisman, a secret more precious than gold, keeping him company in the silence of the night. Imagine two women sitting by a fountain in Córdoba, their hands touching briefly as they pass a jug of water, the touch lasting just long enough to spark a fire that must be hidden but cannot be denied. The contradictions of the Caliphates created a world where love and fear walked side by side, where intimacy was always at risk of discovery yet too powerful to suppress. Chroniclers wrote of rulers with disapproval or amusement, recording gossip as though it were warning. Yet in the very act of writing, they preserved the evidence that these loves existed, evidence we can still read today in margins and footnotes. In stories told as scandal that reveal instead the persistence of the human heart. And as you rest, listening to the soft unfolding of these forgotten lives, you begin to sense that beneath the grandeur of history lies always the quiet pulse of desire, enduring through centuries, carried not in official proclamations, but in stolen glances, in secret verses, in the simple courage of those who dared to feel what could not be named aloud. And that pulse still beats softly now, a reminder that the hidden is as real as the celebrated, that the whispers of the past remain with us like a gentle murmur. Beneath the silence of night as the centuries unfolded, the story of desire within the Caliphates continued to weave itself through countless lives. Some lived boldly in verse and rumor, others hidden so carefully that only the faintest traces remain, yet always there, shaping the culture in ways that official accounts tried to ignore but could never erase. And if we walk slowly through those forgotten corridors of history, we begin to notice how the same themes echo across regions and generations, how poetry, ritual, gossip, and longing created an unbroken thread that bound together rulers and servants, scholars and soldiers, poets and lovers, Imagine the great libraries of Córdoba and Baghdad again. Their shelves heavy with manuscripts, scribes bent over tables copying texts. And among those manuscripts works that dealt with philosophy, medicine, and law, but also preserved fragments. A poetry so rich with affection between men that their survival seems almost miraculous. Some texts were later censored, verses crossed out, words replaced. Yet enough remains to show us that the love they described was not marginal, but central to the lived experience of many. In the gardens of Andalusia, where orange blossoms perfumed the air and water channels reflected moonlight, poets gathered to share their verses, some praising the beauty of young women, others daring to describe the charm of young men. There, voices carrying softly through the night, as courtiers listened with expressions that veiled amusement, scandal, or recognition. The hammams, so central to social life, remained spaces where class was leveled and intimacy found its fragile refuge. Steam rising like a curtain that hid glances and gestures, laughter echoing off tiled walls, hands brushing as if by accident, yet carrying meaning too deep for words. In Persia, Sufi mystics used the language of love for God, but filled their verses with imagery so sensual, so focused on the beauty of the beloved, that readers could not help but hear the human truth behind the divine metaphor. And within this ambiguity, countless lovers found shelter for their own unspoken stories. Picture a gathering in Nishkirpur, candles flickering in the darkness. A Sufi poet speaking of longing so intense it blurs the line between spiritual and earthly passion. His listeners nodding at the divine allegory, while some in the room recognize their own hidden desires reflected back in the cadence of his words. In Cairo, where the Fatimid court glittered with wealth and ceremony, whispers spread about the preferences of rulers and their courtiers, tales told cautiously but retold again and again, for gossip itself became a way of acknowledging what could not be spoken directly, and in those whispers the truth lived on. In Damascus, a jurist might preach sternly against the sins of desire, yet the same city's taverns rang with songs that laughed at such prohibitions, mocking hypocrisy and celebrating human pleasure. The contradictions were everywhere, as if the empire itself lived in a perpetual balance between suppression and expression, denial and indulgence. For women, hidden more deeply from the public eye, intimacy often grew within the spaces allowed by custom. The courtyards and inner rooms of households, the hours spent together weaving, baying, or storytelling, moments where companionship transformed into tenderness, gestures so small they escaped notice, but so powerful they etched themselves into memory. A few rare female poets left behind verses that describe this longing, verses fragile yet enduring, like petals pressed between the pages of history, reminders that their desires were as real as those of their male contemporaries. Across the empire, from the deserts of Arabia to the gardens of Granada, from the mosques of Cairo to the caravan routes of Samarkand, these lives unfolded in silence and laughter, in risk and joy, in secrecy and in art. A soldier might carry with him a memory of a night spent in closeness with a comrade. A scholar might hide his longing in allegory. A merchant might sing a song in a distant market that hints at a love no one else can name. Each of these lives, unrecorded yet undeniable, adds to the tapestry of history, reminding us that even in civilizations remembered for conquest and scholarship, the human heart always moved quietly beneath the surface, seeking what it sought, finding ways to endure, leaving traces that still hum softly centuries later. And as you lie here listening, with your breath slowing and your body sinking deeper into rest, the images of hammams, gardens, palaces, and caravans blur gently together into a single current, a reminder that desire, though silenced in records, never ceases in life. And its quiet pulse runs through the story of the Caliphates like a hidden river, flowing endlessly beneath the ground, invisible yet always present dot as we drift further into the quiet corridors of this untold history. The vastness of the Caliphates reveals itself not only in the splendor of its palaces or the scholarship of its libraries, but in the hidden lives of those who live beneath its arches, whose hearts moved in ways seldom recorded, yet whose traces shimmer faintly in poems, anecdotes, and fragments that survived the tides of time, reminding us that the past was never only law and doctrine, but also breath, touch, and longing. Imagine walking through the streets of Basra at dusk, the air heavy with the scent of spices and the river shimmering gold in the last light, where taverns along the water filled with laughter and song, where poets recited verses that slipped easily between humor and scandal, celebrating beauty in ways that officials condemned but audiences secretly cherished. The poetry of Abu Nuwas, still whispered centuries later, dared to speak openly of male lovers and of pleasures that laws tried to forbid. His verse is both a rebellion and a mirror, reflecting truths that lived in countless lives beyond his own. In Khorasan, another poet might veil his desire in metaphors of light and shadow, of stars yearning for the moon, so that the pious could nod at divine allegory, while the initiated smiled at the coded confession. In the Hammams of Cairo, the steam clouded more than bodies. It blurred the lines of propriety, creating a space where the gaze could linger and laughter could soften into something deeper. And though chroniclers describe these places as centers of vice, their very condemnation reveals the persistence of what they tried to suppress. In Andalusia, under the arches of Córdoba, young scholars gathered in courtyards to study Aristotle, and in the same breath recited verses praising the beauty of their companions, their words carrying double meanings that only the attentive could decode, and thus philosophy and desire walked hand in hand. Picture a night in Granada, the Alhambra's walls glowing in moonlight, courtiers reclining with cups of wine while music drifted across pools of still water, and within that, seen glances exchanged between attendants and nobles. Moments of intimacy that existed in silence, yet burned as brightly as the candles. For women, whose voices were often silenced more thoroughly, intimacy thrived in the shadows of harems and private courtyards where bonds of companionship grew into tenderness, where verses were written in secret and laughter carried undertones of longing. A few rare voices survive, fragments of female poets who dared to speak. One describing the sleeplessness of a night haunted by another woman's presence, another cloaking her passion in the language of friendship, reminding us that their desires were no less real, though they were doubly hidden. Across the deserts and mountains, in caravanserais where merchants from distant lands rested side by side, stories tell of fleeting intimacies formed in the exhaustion of travel, bonds that lasted only a night but left memories carried across continents, whispered later as rumor, sung later in verse. Soldiers on the frontiers, facing the fear of battle and the long silence of waiting, found comfort in one another, their closeness both necessity and passion, recorded only in passing. Lines of chronicles that noted their loyalty without naming the love that bound them. The contradictions of the Caliphates remain constant public sermons condemning what private verses celebrated. Rulers enforcing laws even as their courts were filled with companions whose presence inspired scandal. Jurists writing sternly, while mystics spoke of longing in tones that blurred human and divine. And within these contradictions, ordinary people lived, carrying in their hearts the same tension of secrecy and desire, the same joy of fleeting intimacy, the same sorrow of silence. Picture now a scholar in Samara, his desk lit by a single lamp, copying a verse of Aristotle on friendship, while his mind lingers on the memory of his students' laughter, a memory he dares not write, but which breathes in every line of ink he lays on the page. Picture a woman in Córdoba, seated by a fountain, her embroidery forgotten as she listens to the voice of her companion, each word charged with a tenderness no one else notices, her heart echoing in silence. Picture a soldier lying awake in his tent, the warmth of his companion beside him the only thing keeping fear at bay, a bond as real as any oath, even if unspoken. These scenes, though absent from chronicles, form the undercurrent of history, a reminder that the caliphates were not only empires of conquest and law, but empires of human lives, where desire persisted despite prohibition, where love survived despite silence, where intimacy blossomed in gardens, in baths, in courts, in caravans, in the quiet corners of daily life. And as you listen now, your body sinking deeper into stillness, your breath slow and steady. You can almost hear that undercurrent, like a soft river moving beneath the ground, carrying with it the laughter, the whispers, the verses, and the longings of those who lived centuries ago, still present, still resonant, still refusing to be forgotten. Through the unfolding centuries of the Caliphates, the patterns of desire remained as constant and as hidden as the flow of underground water, invisible to the eye of official history, yet sustaining countless lives, weaving itself into poetry, rumor, art, and memory. And if we listen closely enough, we can hear it still, not in the decrees of rulers, but in the silences of those who live between the lines of law and longing. Imagine the city of Cairo during the height of Fatimid rule, its streets thrumming with merchants from every corner of the known world, its mosques filled with the voices of scholars, its palaces gleaming with marble and mosaics, and among this, splendor the hidden currents of affection flowing quietly, in hammams where steam veiled stolen glances, in gardens where companions lingered beneath palm trees, in the songs of entertainers whose verses hinted at truths that could not be spoken outright. In the margins of chronicles, we find hints of rulers whose reputations were marked by their affections as much as their politics, their courts filled with beautiful attendants described in language too charged to be purely innocent, and the very survival of these stories reminds us that desire was never erased, only disguised. In Córdoba, poets continued to write verses that praised the beauty of young men with imagery as rich and detailed as any used for women. Their words carried by memory and recitation long after the ink faded, creating a secret archive of longing preserved in the rhythm of language itself. In Baghdad, the taverns along the Tigris were places where poets gathered to recite verses of wine and love, sometimes to the delight of audiences who laughed at the audacity, sometimes to the disapproval of clerics who condemned them, but always to the persistence of truth that refused to vanish. Abu Nuwas remained the most famous of these voices, his reputation growing even after his death, his verses copied, censored, and recopied, evidence of a world that could not fully silence him. Imagine a gathering of friends in a candlelit chamber, their cups filled with wine, their laughter echoing, as one recites a verse that dares to speak of the beloved's lips, eyes, and embrace. And in that moment, truth is spoken in the safety of shared company, even if the wider world forbids it. For women, the silence of chronicles did not mean absence. Within harems and domestic courtyards, bonds deepened, sometimes beginning in companionship and unfolding into intimacy, their expressions captured only in rare verses or anecdotes. Yet even these fragments reveal a world as rich and complex as that of men. Picture two women seated beside a window screened with lattice, the moonlight spilling patterns across the floor, one reading a verse aloud in a voice trembling with hidden meaning, the other listening with eyes lowered but heart aflame, their secret held in the safety of night. In Persia, the rise of mystical traditions gave voice to longings that blurred the lines between human and divine love. Poets writing of the beloved as a figure both earthly and transcendent, describing beauty in terms that could be read as spiritual allegory, but which also carried the unmistakable resonance of human desire. These poems allow lovers to hear themselves reflected in the language of piety, to find sanctuary in ambiguity, to preserve their truths within verses that could be passed safely even in dangerous times. Along the caravan routes stretching from Samarkand to Damascus, merchants carried not only goods, but also songs, stories, and poems. And in these oral traditions, the themes of forbidden affection and longing traveled as widely as silk and spices, reminding us that desire was part of the living breath of the empire, carried across deserts and mountains in the voices of travelers. Soldiers in distant garrisons, far from home, found solace in each other, their bonds forged not only by war, but by the intimacy of shared fear and endurance. And though chronicles recorded only their battles, their loyalty, and their victories, the truth of their closeness lingers in the silences between those lines. Imagine a cold night on a frontier post, two men huddled together for warmth, their breath rising in the air, Their companionship deeper than words, a moment never recorded, yet lived as vividly as any victory. These scenes, scattered across regions and centuries, remind us that the caliphates, often remembered only as empires of conquest and learning, were also worlds of hidden humanity, where love and longing refused to be erased, where silence was itself a form of preservation, carrying truths across time like seeds hidden in the folds of history, waiting to be noticed again. And as you drift further into stillness, listening to the unfolding of these forgotten stories, you can sense the quiet resilience of desire, persisting in gardens, in hammams, in taverns, in verses, in whispers, flowing endlessly beneath the grand narratives, soft yet unyielding, reminding us that even the most guarded of civilizations could not silence the heart's unspoken language. The unfolding of this hidden history continues to reveal the caliphates as worlds not only of scholars, conquerors, and rulers, but of lovers, poets, companions, and dreamers whose desires carved themselves into the silence of centuries, persisting like faint inscriptions on stone, worn yet indelible. And when we allow ourselves to walk among those lives with gentleness, we find that what survives of them is not scandal or sin, but the simple and profound reality of human hearts reaching for one another in the midst of empires. In Baghdad, where the golden domes reflected the rising sun and the call to prayer echoed across the Tigris, scholars in the House of Wisdom debated the works of Plato, who spoke openly of affection between men, and though their own writings clothed such ideas in caution, the very act of copying and preserving those texts meant that these ideas flowed into the bloodstream of Islamic thought. Jurists and theologians might preach prohibition, yet poets and mystics continued to craft verses that blurred divine and human love, filling their stanzas with descriptions of the beloved's eyes, lips, hair, gestures, images so sensual that their audience could not mistake the underlying truth. In the hammams, steam curled around every body like a cloak, veiling intimacy while exposing vulnerability, creating a paradox where law and custom dissolved in the fog of heat and water. And it was here that countless encounters unfolded, some fleeting, some lasting, none recorded but all real. Picture a hammam in Damascus, tiled in blue and white, lanterns glowing softly, voices echoing off the stone, and in that warmth men laughed together, whispered secrets, touched in gestures, small enough to pass unnoticed yet heavy with meaning for those who lived them. In Córdoba, under the flowering arches and perfumed courtyards, poets recited verses before gatherings of nobles, verses that described love so intensely it made listeners shift uneasily, caught between scandal and recognition, their laughter betraying a shared knowledge that the poet had given voice to what many felt but dared not name. In Granada, courtiers reclined beside still pools of water, musicians playing gentle melodies while attendants poured wine, and in that atmosphere of beauty and indulgence, love was often as much part of the evening as music itself, whispered in glances, spoken in verses, lived in silences. For women, intimacy often lived in the hidden corners of harems, where seclusion created both limitation and possibility. And within those enclosed spaces, bonds deepened into tenderness, expressed in shared stories, songs, and secret touches. Their voices rarely written, but still surviving in fragments of poetry that speak of longing with a delicacy that makes the silence around them even more striking. A rare verse describes the torment of missing another woman's presence, a torment that burned like fire under the cool surface of friendship, its very existence proof that such loves not only existed, but were powerful enough to drive words into permanence despite all attempts at erasure. Along caravan routes stretching into Central Asia, merchants carry poems and songs as much as goods. And in these songs, one hears the persistence of themes of hidden affection, laughter mingling with melancholy, verses that spoke of longing for companions left behind, verses so universal they cross languages and cultures with ease. Soldiers on remote frontiers carried similar truths in their hearts, their lives bound by loyalty and danger, their nights softened by companionship that moved beyond duty into something unspoken yet deeply felt. Imagine two men sharing a cloak, Under desert stars, their bodies pressed close for warmth, their silence heavier than words, their bond stronger than any written oath, a truth so common it needed no chronicle to exist. In Persia, Sufi mystics wrote of divine love in terms so human that the line between earthly and spiritual desire disappeared. And for those who lived in silence, their verses became sanctuary, a place to hear their own longing reflected back. In words that could be spoken aloud without punishment, their ambiguity a shield and a lifeline. The paradoxes endured everywhere. Rulers rumored to indulge while enforcing prohibitions. Poets celebrated while condemned. Jurists writing strict codes while society quietly lived otherwise. A tension that reveals the impossibility of fully silencing human desire. In every city, from Cairo to Basra, from Nishapur to Granada, loves unfolded quietly, filled with laughter, risk, longing, secrecy, tenderness, and fear. And though the chronicles tried to reduce humanity to law, the truth endured in gestures, in verses, in the memory of glances exchanged in candlelight. Imagine a scholar hunched over his desk, writing lines on virtue and philosophy, while in his heart replaying the voice of a beloved student. Imagine a woman gazing at the shadow of her companion, dancing across the wall by lamplight, knowing she cannot speak her longing, yet feeling it in every heartbeat. Imagine a poet finishing a verse and hiding it beneath his robe, his pulse racing at the thought that someone someday might read it and understand. These are the lives that existed in parallel to the grandeur of empire, invisible in records, yet eternal in truth. And as you listen now, your breath slowing, your mind softening, you can feel their persistence like a murmur beneath history's noise, a reminder that every age, no matter how guarded, carries within it the quiet resilience of love got as the centuries of the Caliphates stretched onward. The hidden lives of desire continued to shape the quiet undercurrent of society, woven through the rhythm of ordinary days and extraordinary nights, never erased though seldom spoken. And when we lean in closely enough, we find that beneath the grandeur of empire, there was always the hum of longing, the whispers of intimacy, the unrecorded tenderness that refuses to vanish from human memory. In Baghdad, as scholars debated the finer points of law, poetry thrived with verses that carried meanings beyond their surface. Verses where the beloved was described with such precision, the curve of the neck, the grace of movement, the sparkle of eyes that no allegory could fully disguise the passion behind them. The taverns along the river filled with these words, laughter rising in the candlelit haze, while clerics in nearby mosques thundered sermons against corruption, a contrast so sharp it reveals the very contradictions at the heart of society. In the Hammams of Basra, steam blurred boundaries and conversation softened into whispers. And though the official line condemned, the daily life of people unfolded otherwise, with fleeting touches, lingering glances, and friendships that blossomed into intimacies unrecorded. In Córdoba, young scholars gathered in shaded courtyards, their voices reciting Aristotle by day and verses of longing by night, their studies and their desires intertwining like the arches of the city's great mosque, inseparable in the lives they lived even if separated in the records they left behind. Granada, too, under moonlit skies, hosted gatherings where poetry, music, and wine mingled with desire, the courtyards filled with fountains and orange blossoms, providing the perfect setting for verses that both celebrated and disguised passion. For women, silence was heavier, their voices fewer, yet still present in fragments that carry across time with startling clarity. A verse describing the touch of another's hand, the ache of separation, the joy of presence, fragments so delicate and rare they shine like hidden jewels in the dust of history. Within the harems of palaces, companionship often deepened into intimacy, expressed in laughter shared behind screens, in songs sung softly at night, in gestures unnoticed by the world beyond those walls. Along the caravan routes, merchants shared not only goods, but stories, poems, and songs. Their nights spent in the company of fellow travelers, sometimes giving birth to bonds remembered long after the journey ended, whispered in songs across regions as distant as Samarkand and Fez. Soldiers on the empire's borders carried their own silent stories, their loyalty and bravery recorded, but their nights of comfort with one another left unspoken, existing only in their memories, yet as real as any conquest. In Persia, the mystics continued to blur lines with verses that soared toward God, while describing beauty in language so earthly it could not help but mirror human desire. And within that ambiguity, countless listeners found solace, recognizing themselves in the words. While claiming only piety, the paradox persisted everywhere. Rulers rumored for their indulgences while enforcing strict codes. Poets punished, yet their verses preserved. Jurists condemning, yet society laughing at poems in secret. Women silenced, yet still finding ways to voice their truths. Imagine a scholar in Cairo, his study filled with manuscripts, his lips moving as he reads aloud a verse that makes his heart tremble, though he pretends it is allegory. Imagine a young woman in Córdoba writing a secret poem for her beloved and tucking it away where no one will find it. Imagine two soldiers leaning against each other under desert stars, their closeness a fragile refuge against fear. These images remind us that beneath every empire lies a hidden empire of human hearts, one not built on stone but on breath, touch, memory, and courage. And though official chronicles tried to silence it, its pulse continues to beat, soft and steady, like the murmur of water under the surface of history, carrying forward the truth that love, even forbidden, endures dot across the centuries of the Caliphates. Desire continued to find its secret pathways through the lives of rulers and commoners alike, slipping past the weight of law and the gaze of clerics, surviving in gardens, in hammams, in whispered verses and fleeting glances, in ways so subtle and ordinary that they became part of the rhythm of daily life even as society officially denied them. Baghdad, with its crowded streets and golden domes, remained a city of contradictions, its scholars debating law in one chamber, while in another poets sang a beauty with words so transparent in their affection for young men that the meaning could not be ignored. And even though scribes tried to obscure or censor their verses, enough survived to remind us that poetry was always the truest record of longing. In taverns by the river, men gathered over wine, laughing at daring verses that mocked hypocrisy, and in those spaces, truth was spoken openly, if only for a night. In Córdoba, gardens bloomed with fountains and orange blossoms, and within these spaces, companions walked side by side, exchanging poems that spoke with double meanings, understood by those who lived the experience while veiled enough to pass for allegory among the pious. In Granada's Alhambra, where light and water played endlessly against carved stone, gatherings of courtiers included music, laughter, wine, and desire, glances exchanged as easily as words, moments of intimacy unfolding in silence, preserved only in rumor and verse. For women, whose lives were enclosed more tightly, intimacy grew in courtyards and harems, in the long hours of companionship, where affection deepened into passion, hidden from chronicles but alive in memory, in songs sung softly, in laughter that carried undertones of longing, in rare fragments of verse that slipped into the written record like fragile leaves pressed into stone. One such fragment speaks of the torment of absence, of a woman lying awake, haunted by the memory of another's voice, her longing disguised as friendship, but burning through the lines with unmistakable clarity, proof that silence never meant absence. Along the caravan routes, where merchants traveled from Samarkand to Damascus, intimacy unfolded in the exhaustion of long journeys. Companions sharing tents and fires, bonds formed out of necessity, often transforming into moments of passion, remembered later only in songs and stories carried from city to city. Soldiers, too, stationed on distant frontiers, found comfort in one another during long nights of waiting, their loyalty praised by chroniclers while their intimacy remained unspoken, a truth too ordinary and too human to appear in the stern lines of history, yet as real as they fought. In Persia, mystics continued to write verses that blurred the line between the human and the divine, describing the beauty of the beloved in ways that echoed earthly passion as much as spiritual devotion. And in this ambiguity, countless lovers found sanctuary, able to see themselves in words that could be explained away as allegory, yet rang true as confession. Picture a Sufi poet reciting in a dimly lit concha, his words describing the eyes of the beloved with such intensity that his listeners shift between devotion and recognition, some hearing God, others hearing their own hidden truths reflected. Back at them. Picture a scholar in Cairo bent over a manuscript, his lips moving as he reads a Greek verse on friendship, his mind straying to memories of his students' laughter, a memory he cannot write, cannot forget. Picture a woman in Córdoba seated in the cool shadow of a courtyard, her embroidery forgotten as she listens to the voice of her companion, every word heavy with unspoken meaning. Picture two young soldiers in the desert, their shoulders pressed, together under the stars, silence speaking what words cannot. These images, scattered across the vast expanse of the Caliphates, remind us that love and longing were never absent, only hidden, and that despite prohibitions, punishments, and sermons, desire endured, leaving traces in poetry, in rumor, in memory, in the very silences that hum beneath the surface of history. And as you listen now, your breath slowing, your eyes heavy, you can feel those silences, not as emptiness, but as fullness, carrying across centuries the truth that human hearts have always found their way, even when the world refused to see. Them as the Caliphates expanded and contracted across centuries, their borders shifting with wars and dynasties, the quieter histories of love and longing remain constant beneath the turbulence, threading their way through palaces, schools, marketplaces, and private homes, reminding us that even empires, built on conquest and faith, could not extinguish the most ordinary of human truths. That desire is as enduring as breath, as persistent as memory. Baghdad, still shimmering in imagination as a beacon of knowledge and power, was also a city of contradictions, where judges condemned acts of forbidden intimacy, while poets recited verses that praised the curve of a cheek or the softness of a voice. Their words passed hand to hand like contraband, yet treasured more than gold. In its gardens at night, shaded by cypress and lit by oil lamps, friends gathered to drink, to recite, to laugh, and within these gatherings affection unfolded, in gestures small enough to escape notice, yet powerful enough to bind hearts. In Córdoba, under the arches of its great mosque and the flowering courtyards of its palaces, scholars who spent the day writing commentaries on Aristotle or Galen spent their nights reciting poems of longing, their lives divided by necessity, but united by desire, their verses carrying meanings clear to those who shared their hidden reality. In Granada, where water and stone seemed to sing together in the Alhambra's endless interplay of light and shadow, courtiers reclined on cushions while musicians played, and amid the music and laughter glances were exchanged, touches lingered, and affections took form in silence, more eloquent than speech. Cairo, too, with its labyrinth of alleys, its hammams steaming with voices, its mosques filled with scholars, carried within it countless hidden stories, where intimacy unfolded in spaces shielded by tradition, behind screens and curtains, in the privacy of courtyards, in the laughter of women whose companionship grew into tenderness. Fragments of female poetry remind us of this truth, verses describing sleeplessness, separation, and longing, verses that seem innocent until read with the ear of one who has known desire concealed by necessity. Along the caravan routes stretching, across deserts and mountains, travelers shared tents and fires, their journeys long and their solitude heavy, and in that closeness bonds deepen into passion, sometimes lasting a night, sometimes becoming memories carried across continents. Soldiers on distant frontiers, praised in chronicles for loyalty and courage, carried their own unrecorded truths, finding in each other comfort against fear, love against loneliness, tenderness against the weight of war, their intimacy existing quietly beyond the lines of official record, yet etched deeply into their own lives. In Persia, the mystical poets continued to blur the lines between human and divine, their words resonating across centuries with an ambiguity that sheltered countless. hidden loves, their imagery of the beloved's beauty resonating both as devotion to God and as confession of human desire. Picture a gathering in Nishapur, candles glowing against walls painted with geometric designs, a Sufi poet reciting verses that describe eyes shining like stars, lips red as wine, gestures that intoxicate, his listeners nodding at the divine. Allegory, while those who carried secrets in their hearts heard in those words their own longing reflected back. Picture a scholar in Cairo, seated at a desk piled with manuscripts, his eyes lingering not on the words before him, but on the memory of his students' laughter, his pulse quickening at something he will never commit to paper. Picture two women in Córdoba, seated by a fountain, their hands brushing as they share a cup of water, the gesture lingering a moment too long, a moment that will be remembered long after the water itself is gone. Picture two soldiers lying beneath desert stars, their silence heavy, their closeness both protection and confession, a truth that will never reach chronicles, but which is as much a part of history as any conquest. All of these images remind us that beneath the surface of empire, beneath the weight of law, beneath the proclamations of rulers and clerics, there existed always the quiet persistence of love, living in shadows yet never extinguished, flowing across centuries like a hidden river, carrying forward the truth that human hearts have always spoken their own language, even when the world refused to hear them. Through the long arc of centuries, the caliphates carried within them a current of intimacy that slipped beneath the official currents of conquest and faith, flowing quietly through the spaces of daily life, sometimes daring to surface in poems and rumors, sometimes remaining hidden in glances and silences, yet always present. A reminder that history is not only the tale of rulers and battles, but also of ordinary people who loved in ways that did not fit within the lines of law. In Baghdad, where scholars preserve Greek philosophy and astronomers map the heavens, people lived their own earthly truths in courtyards filled with the scent of jasmine and rosewater, in taverns where verses were sung with laughter and boldness, in hammams where steam veiled the body but revealed the heart. Abu Nuwas, boldest of poets, left verses so unflinching in their celebration of wine, love, and the beauty of men that later generations tried to erase him, yet his words lived on, copied and carried, proof that what was condemned could not be silenced. In Córdoba, scholars by day and poets by night filled the air with words that praised both philosophy and passion. There lives an intricate dance between public duty and private desire. In Granada, under the star-speckled sky and beside fountains, whispering through marble channels, gatherings of courtiers blurred the line between entertainment and affection, where poetry recited beneath orange blossoms became confessions veiled as art. Cairo, with its labyrinth of alleys, its bustling markets, and its hidden courtyards, held similar contradictions, clerics and mosques denouncing sin even as rumors swirled about the affections of rulers and scholars, whispers that traveled faster than sermons. The hammams in every city were stages of intimacy disguised as ritual, where men and women alike found fleeting sanctuaries from the rigid order outside. For women, the harems and private chambers became their hidden world of laughter and tenderness, a space where companionship bloomed into intimacy, where verses were exchanged in secrecy, where longing pressed itself into the quiet of night. Fragments of female poetry, rare but luminous, speak of nights sleepless with desire, of voices haunting memory, of touches disguised as friendship but burning with passion. Along the caravan routes, intimacy lived in the exhaustion of shared travel, in tents pitched under desert stars where merchants and travelers found in each other warmth and companionship. Their stories carried across lands not only as trade, but as song and memory. Soldiers, praised for valor, carried their own hidden tenderness, their nights softened by closeness with companions, their loyalty to each other running deeper than chronicles dared to record. In Persia, Sufi mystics filled their verses with longing so intense that it could not be confined to divine allegory alone, describing beauty in terms so sensual that countless lovers heard their own secret truth sheltered in the rhythm of devotion. A gathering in Nishapur might glow with the light of candles, A poet describing the beloved's eyes as stars, lips as wine, gestures as intoxicating as prayer. And while the faithful nodded at the allegory, others felt the sting of recognition. In their chests, their own hidden longing brought into voice. A scholar in Cairo might copy lines on virtue while his thoughts strayed to the laughter of his student, a memory sweeter than the ink staining his fingers. Two women in Córdoba might share water at a fountain, their hands brushing, their eyes lowering in silence, the moment passing unrecorded yet never forgotten. Two soldiers in the desert might press close beneath one cloak, their silence heavier than any oath, their closeness as real as any victory. These scattered moments, though never gathered by official chroniclers, formed the living heart of society, a heart that beat quietly but insistently beneath the weight of law, preserving in silence what the world refused to name. And as you listen now, your breath softening into rhythm with these lives, you can feel that hidden current still flowing, a current that carried their desires through centuries, reminding us that history is not only what was declared, but also what was whispered, not only what was written, but also what was lived. And that love, even forbidden, leaves its mark on every age dot as the Caliphates matured into layered civilizations that span continents. From the deserts of Arabia to the lush orchards of Andalusia and the bazaars of Central Asia, the patterns of hidden desire persisted, not as isolated scandals, but as a quiet rhythm of life, always present beneath the surface of official doctrine, threading its way through courts, mosques, gardens, hammams, and caravanserais, preserved in poems and whispered stories, remembered in fragments of verse, in gossip, and in memory. In Baghdad, poets still recited verses that dared to cross the boundaries set by law, some praising the intoxicating beauty of young men in lines so transparent that no allegory could conceal their meaning, their audacity both condemned and cherished. While mystics transformed the same longing into metaphors of divine pursuit, creating a space where human desire could survive under the shelter of ambiguity. In Córdoba, under arches that shimmered with reflected light, scholars who debated logic and medicine by day spoke poetry by night, reciting verses that balanced on the knife edge of confession and concealment, each word carrying more than its surface. In Granada, by the moonlit pools of the Alhambra, courtiers exchanged glances across the shimmer of water, gestures of tenderness hidden behind the ritual of gatherings, moments of intimacy that remain unrecorded except in the memory of those who dared them. Cairo, too, carried its hidden currents clerics, preached sternly from pulpits, while rumors swirled through the markets of rulers and scholars, whose preferences became the subject of whispered stories, gossip itself becoming a form of record, proof that what was denied in law could not be erased in life. Hammams, always central to daily life, became sanctuaries where class dissolved in steam, where bodies mingled in an atmosphere of vulnerability and laughter, where the language of the eyes and of touch could speak truths forbidden outside their walls, truths lived in fleeting encounters, yet remembered long after. For women, harems and courtyards became their hidden worlds, where companionship grew into tenderness, where songs carried undertones of longing, where gestures, small and unnoticed by others, became the carriers of immense meaning. Fragments of female poetry that survived, rare yet powerful, speak of sleepless nights haunted by another woman's absence, of joy in her presence, of the fire of passion disguised as friendship, lines that remind us that even doubled layers of silence could not extinguish desire. Along the caravan routes that stitched the empire together, intimacy unfolded in the exhaustion of travel, in tents pitched under vast desert skies, where merchants and travelers shared warmth and stories, sometimes for a night, sometimes forming. Memories carried across lands, whispered later in songs as universal truths of longing. Soldiers at the empire's borders carried their own hidden tenderness, bonds formed in fear and endurance, loyalties that deepened into love unrecorded by chroniclers but etched deeply into their lives, as real as the wars they fought. In Persia, the language of mystics continued to shelter countless unspoken loves, Verses describing the beloved in imagery so sensual and so precise that the divine allegory could not fully mask the human truth. And in those verses, lovers found recognition, finding themselves reflected in the language of devotion. Picture a gathering in Nishaper, candles flickering, a poet describing the beloved's lips as sweet as wine, eyes as bright as stars. A verse that makes some listeners nod solemnly at the divine allegory while others feel their own secret longing. Mirrored. Picture a scholar in Cairo, pausing in his work, his ink-stained hands resting on the page as his mind drifts to the memory of a student's smile. Picture two women in Córdoba sharing water from the same jug, their hands brushing longer than custom allows, their silence holding more truth than any words. Picture two soldiers in the desert, cloaks wrapped tight, their shoulders pressed. Together, their companionship both necessity and confession. These images, scattered across regions and centuries, remind us that love and longing were never absent, only hidden, carried forward not in official records, but in poems, in silences, in the gestures of countless unnamed people who lived their truth quietly. And as you listen now, drifting deeper into stillness, you can feel that undercurrent still alive, a quiet murmur beneath the surface of history, carrying across time the truth that even in the most guarded civilizations, the heart has always found its own language, a language that survives even when silence tries to erase it. As the Caliphates entered new centuries, their land stretching from the Atlantic shores of Andalusia to the bustling trade cities of Central Asia, the unrecorded stories of intimacy and desire remain woven into the fabric of daily life, existing beneath sermons and laws, beneath victories and defeats, like a quiet current that could never be stilled, shaping lives in ways history books rarely dare to name. In Baghdad, poets still recited verses that praised beauty with audacity, their words laced with affection for young men so transparent that even later censors could not conceal them. And though clerics thundered against immorality, the popularity of such poetry revealed that society continued to listen, to laugh, to remember. In Córdoba, the great mosque with its endless arches sheltered scholars who by day engaged in philosophy and jurisprudence, and by night recited verses of longing. In courtyards perfumed with orange blossoms, their voices carrying truths they could not live openly. In Granada, the Alhambra glittered with pools reflecting moonlight, and in those gatherings of courtiers and musicians, glances and gestures spoke of affections that passed unrecorded yet live with intensity in memory. In Cairo, alleys echoed with gossip as much as with prayer, rumors of rulers and scholars whose personal lives contradicted their public stance. Proof that desire was not confined to the powerless, but moved equally in the highest ranks. Hammams across the empire remain both practical and symbolic spaces, their steam and warmth erasing differences of class while allowing desire to pass quietly in glances and touches. Fleeting encounters lived without record yet remembered privately as moments of freedom in a world that forbade. For women, intimacy bloomed in the hidden spaces of harems and private courtyards, where companionship softened into tenderness, where songs carried undertones of longing, where hands lingered a fraction too long, their gestures invisible to outsiders but powerful to those who lived them. Rare fragments of female poetry still reach us, verses that speak of restless nights spent thinking of another woman's presence, of joy when reunited, of love disguised as friendship but burning. Between the lines, reminders that silence never meant absence. Along caravan routes, merchants and travelers shared tents and fires under desert skies, their journeys long and weary, their closeness forming bonds that sometimes crossed into passion, fleeting yet etched permanently in memory, carried across lands as whispered stories and songs. Soldiers at distant garrisons carried their own hidden histories, their loyalty and bravery preserved in chronicles, but their intimacy with one another omitted, though their lives proved that affection formed as surely as alliances, that tenderness found its place even amid war. In Persia, mystics continued to shape a language where longing could be hidden safely, verses describing the beloved's eyes, lips, and hair with such intensity that their allegory could not erase their human truth, giving countless hidden lovers a mirror in which to see themselves. Picture a gathering in Nishaper, the flicker of lamps against painted walls. A poet describing the beloved in terms so vivid that his listeners shift uneasily, some cloaking the words in piety, others hearing their own hearts unveiled. Picture a scholar in Cairo, pausing over a manuscript as the memory of his student's voice makes the page blur before his eyes. Picture two women in Córdoba, their laughter spilling into the night as their shoulders brush, their intimacy unspoken, but undeniable. Picture two soldiers pressed together under one cloak, their silence as binding as any oath, their companionship as deep as love itself. These scattered moments across centuries reveal that intimacy persisted regardless of condemnation, living in shadows yet always alive, carried not in decrees or chronicles, but in poems, in whispers, in gestures, in memories that refuse to vanish. And as you rest now, letting these stories wash over you, you can feel that current still flowing, soft and steady. A reminder that history is never only what was declared, but also what was lived. That the heart's language endures even when the world pretends not to hear it. As the centuries moved forward and the caliphates rose, fractured, and reformed under new dynasties, the deeper truth of human longing never altered, persisting quietly beneath sermons, wars, and proclamations. Carried in the laughter of gatherings, in the glances of strangers, in verses carefully written and secretly preserved. And when we look closely enough, we see that the pulse of intimacy was never absent, only hidden, a secret companion to the grandeur of empire. In Baghdad, even after its libraries and palaces bore the scars of conflict, poetry continued to sing of desire, verses praising beauty with audacity, celebrating affection between men in tones so bold that scribes centuries later still attempted to erase them, yet the very act of censoring proved how impossible it was to silence. In Córdoba and Granada, under the arches and fountains of Andalusian courts, poetry remained the language of confession disguised as art, verses describing the beloved's lips, eyes, and touch in language that could be heard as divine allegory, but was clearly saturated with human passion, verses recited under orange trees, beside still pools, in moonlit courtyards where courtiers reclined with cups of wine, their laughter betraying recognition. In Cairo, clerics preached stern warnings from pulpits, yet in the markets and hammams, in the alleys and courtyards, gossip told another story, of rulers whose affections became subjects of rumor, of scholars whose students were remembered not, only for their brilliance, but for the closeness of their bonds. Hammams throughout the empire continued to serve as both necessary ritual and fragile sanctuary, their steam softening the strictness of the world outside, allowing encounters so fleeting they left no record yet so powerful they lingered in memory. For women, harems and secluded spaces of the home became sites of tenderness, where companionship deepened into intimacy in the long hours of sewing, singing, and storytelling, where the sound of laughter hid the undertone of longing, where gestures, invisible to outsiders, carried immense meaning. Rare verses survive that reveal these hidden lives. A line about sleepless nights spent yearning for another's voice, another about the joy of secret presence. And though they come to us in fragments, their existence is proof of truths that could not be extinguished. Along caravan routes stretching across deserts, mountains, and plains, intimacy traveled as surely as trade. Companions sharing tents and firelight under vast skies, bonds forming out of exhaustion and necessity, but transforming into moments of passion carried in memory long after parting, sometimes whispered later in songs sung by travelers in distant markets. Soldiers on remote frontiers lived the same contradictions. Praise for loyalty and bravery in chronicles that never spoke of the warmth they found in one another, though such warmth was as enduring as their duty, as real as their battles. In Persia, Sufi mystics continued to craft verses where longing was sanctified by allegory, their poems describing the beloved in such human detail that listeners could not fail to recognize themselves. And so within this double language, countless Hidden lovers found recognition and shelter, able to hear their own truths mirrored back under the cover of devotion. Picture a gathering in Nishaper, lamps glowing against intricate tiles. A mystic describing the beloved's beauty with such intensity that some listeners nod piously while others sit silently, their hearts stirred by recognition of their own forbidden feelings. Picture a scholar in Cairo, pausing over his manuscript as the memory of a student's smile floods his chest with warmth he dares not write. Picture two women in Córdoba, their laughter fading into silence as their eyes meet, the moment as fragile and powerful as any verse. Picture two soldiers in the desert, pressed close under one cloak, their silence speaking louder than words, their bond as real as any oath of loyalty. These images, scattered across centuries and regions, form the living heart of the Caliphates, a heart not carved in marble or written in decrees, but beating quietly in the shadows, reminding us that beneath the weight of law and power there always lived the softer, unrecorded truths of affection, tenderness, and desire. And as you rest now, letting these stories settle into you like the steady rhythm of your own breath, you can feel that pulse still present, a soft continuity across. Time, whispering that love, though hidden, always survives, always finds its way, and always leaves its mark on the world. And now, as the story softens into silence, what remains is not only the record of empires that rose and fell, but the quieter record of countless unnamed lives whose loves endured in shadows, whispered in verses, and carried forward in silences that spoke more deeply than proclamations. The Caliphates are remembered for their scholarship, their architecture, their power. Yet behind the stone arches and the libraries of wisdom, there flowed an unseen current, the laughter of friends in candlelit courtyards, the glances exchanged in hammams veiled by steam, the poems tucked carefully into the folds of clothing, the sleepless nights haunted by the absence of a beloved, the moments of tenderness between soldiers, scholars, merchants, and women in hidden courtyards, all of them living truths that could not be erased. What this history teaches is that even in societies bound by law and faith, the human heart remained untamed, finding ways to express itself in allegory, in rumor, in memory, and in the resilience of love that defied silence. Perhaps as you rest now, your breath steady, your body softened by the rhythm of listening, you can feel those echoes still alive, the hum of voices carried across centuries, reminding you that history is never only the story of rulers, but also of lovers, never only of laws, but of longings, never only of silence, but of the truths hidden within it. Maybe your eyes are growing heavy. Maybe the images of orange-scented gardens, tile baths, moonlit palaces, and desert camps are fading into dreams. Yet within that drifting lies the recognition that love, in all its forms, has always survived. That it belongs to the deepest current of humanity, that it continues still, soft and unbroken, like a river flowing beneath the ground. And if you carry anything from this journey tonight, let it be this: that every age has its silences, but also its whispers, and those whispers endure, shaping the world quietly but surely. So let your eyes close gently now. Let the story settle into quiet, and if you have found a spark of calm or recognition in these hidden histories, carry it softly with you into sleep. Subscribe to our channel if you wish to continue walking through these untold corridors of history, and until we meet again on another night, may your rest be deep, may your dreams be gentle, and may the whispers of the past remind you always of the endurance of love.